Sled training. How should you program it for hunting? What kind of mobility training should you be doing outside of the gym? And which deadlifts are functional? Those are listener questions that got sent in, and those are the questions that I'm going to answer for you during this episode. Hello, I'm Todd Bumgardner. I am the founder of Pack Mule Training Company, and this is the Train Smarter, Hunt Longer podcast. I'm going to walk through these questions for you. I'm going to save the functional question for last, and I'm actually going to get into a deeper explanation of what functional training means. So stick around for that. And we're going to jump in with the sled training question. So this was a comment from a listener on YouTube. He asked me, how would I program sled training for hunting? Now, when we say sleds, we mean pushing sleds, so getting behind them and pushing them, and then also dragging sleds. And as it goes with anything, how you program it, how you use the tool depends on the goal. And that's going to be an overarching theme of this, of at least this question and the last question, is we don't necessarily want to look at the tool. We want to look at the outcome that we want to produce. Okay. So when it comes to sled training, it really depends on the goal. You can use sleds for a lot of different stuff when it comes to training for hunting. So two ways to break it down from a broad perspective is you want to think about pushing a sled is more for uphill drive, right? Because you're actually driving the sled forward. So you're going to think about how those angles translate into marching up a hill, which they translate pretty well. And then when it comes to sled pulls, we're doing those for posterior chain development. And when I say posterior chain, I mean your calves, your hamstrings, your glutes, and your back. Now, you're going to get calf work out of driving a sled as well. It's just going to be different, right? And so you think about it from that standpoint when you break it down that way. If you're thinking about uphill drive, you're going to push. If you're thinking about posterior chain, you're going to pull. And so you could ask, well, most of going uphill is driving. I mean, to a degree, right? But think about when you have your pack on and you're going uphill, regardless of how upright you try to remain, you're going to lean over some. And so that means there's going to be an element of pulling yourself up the hill as you drive as well. So your hamstrings need to be able to be strong enough and have the muscular endurance to be able to help pull yourself up the hill. Also, developing your posterior chain and making your back strong is going to help you support your pack more because it's sitting on your back, right? So it's important that we also train the muscles that pull us up the hill, and help us remain strong underneath our pack. And so we have to do pulling stuff. And I've mentioned this before in articles and in emails and stuff. If you're not on our newsletter list, you probably should be. I send out 5 great emails per week. We typically stick with higher volume work for a posterior chain because we need that durability to maintain the pull and also keep ourselves stable and strong underneath our pack. And so we do a lot more high volume work for our posterior chain, and the work for the front of our body, our quads, varies because they take the brunt of the stress because of driving uphill, right? But then they also do most of the control when we come downhill. So they just get more overall training volume through a wider range of training inputs. So, we squat heavy, but we also do eccentric reps with, split squats and different things like that. So we vary it because we need more durable quads because we need them to last. Okay. So that's kind of the breakdown from a training standpoint. Now, when we think about the different qualities we want to develop, then we think about how we apply the tool, right? So if we're thinking about power development, we would load the sled probably a little bit heavier and sprint with it, right? So sled sprints while pushing the sled are really great for that. And here's why. A couple reasons. First, you don't have to decelerate. And that's one of the big risks that comes with sprinting, right? Especially on flat ground. And if you're not super well conditioned for it, you have to slow yourself down at the end of the sprint. And that's when a lot of injuries happen. Well, if you sprint with a sled, you don't have to slow yourself down because you already are fighting the inertia of the sled to sprint. So you slow down without having to do that. You don't have to use your body to slow yourself down, which is a really, really useful thing. Same thing happens when you sprint up a hill, right? You don't have to slow yourself down because you're not going down the hill. If you're going down the hill, you'd have to decelerate. But since you're just going up the hill, all you have to worry about is accelerating. So power development, it's a really good thing for that. Why would hunters worry about power development? First of all, because you're a human being, and being able to express power as a human being is an important thing. And it's one of the most important things for our longevity. Also, power development in that kind of a way translates over to strength development and strength endurance development because it's all neurological, right? So it's about sending nerve impulses to your muscles to make them contract fast. The more power you have, it exists on the same spectrum. So if you develop power, sometimes it's easier to develop strength. Sometimes when you get stronger, it's easier to develop power. So we need to touch both of those things because relative strength is important for hunters because it makes us more resilient, and it also it makes everything cost less. So the stronger you are relative to your body weight, the less energy you have to use to do everything because everything takes place at a lower relative intensity compared to what you're capable of. So we want to develop those things. Then there's strength endurance, which is the ability to use your strength a lot of times over time and effort without fatigue. This is important because we need to be able to continue to send strong nerve impulses as we march uphill, as we march downhill, so that our muscles contract. And it works hand in hand with muscular endurance, but we have to develop those things, right? So doing sled sprints for power development is a good thing. Now you can do them with a drag sled. I think that's more specific to training sprinters and things like that. I think for us, power development with sleds comes better with doing sled sprints while pushing a sled. Just because of the hamstring stress of sprinting with a drag sled, you know, it takes time and preparation and specificity to be ready to handle that and not give your hamstrings too much stress. So I'd rather see somebody sprint with a push sled than with a drag sled. And then other things that we can do with a sled is high intensity continuous training. Now, this is something that we do a lot of in various forms. It's great for two things. It's great for developing strength endurance, which is something that we just mentioned, but also muscular endurance in your fast twitch muscle fibers. So you have two types of fast twitch muscle fibers. You have type 2X and you have type 2A. Type 2X require a very high threshold and typically just burn on carbs, right? So they don't respond to aerobic stimulus all that well. So you're really not going to use them as much when you're hunting. At least you probably shouldn't, because if you're getting into your fast twitch muscle fibers, you're not as conditioned as you should be for what you're trying to do. You're starting to redline. You're going to burn through your resources. It's going to be really difficult to recover. That's not to say that you shouldn't develop some fast twitch muscular endurance. And we do that with things like lactate threshold intervals and things like that, just to help round out the top end of our aerobic system so that we fight fatigue better. And also we'll do some VO2 max stuff sometimes, not necessarily develop your VO2 max because that's way overrated, but because some of the adaptations that you get from doing VO2 max training, like getting your heart to contract harder so you pump out more blood with each beat, rounds out your cardiac output, which is something you get a lot of from doing zone 1 and zone 2 work. And then if you put some VO2 max work on top of that, it just kind of rounds out the system really nicely so that you can deliver more oxygen and nutrients to your muscles as they work. So you can get some fast twitch muscular endurance from that kind of work. But HICT actually offers an aerobic stimulus to your fast twitch muscles, which is really, really great because you get a hard enough contraction to contract your type 2A fibers. And they kind of live in the middle between slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. So you can develop them aerobically. They have more mitochondrial density than, and more aerobic enzymes than your type 2X muscles fibers do. And so we want to be able to use them both because they'll help us fight fatigue, but also because a lot of times, you know, we're going into environments where the oxygen gradient changes, and that means going to elevation. And so logically, the better you are throughout your body at utilizing oxygen and functioning aerobically, the better you'll do. And so we want to do it for that too. So high intensity continuous training, how would you do it with a sled? So it would look like one heavy step every 4 to 5 seconds. So you do a big drive with one leg. At the top of the next 4th or 5th second, you do another drive with the other leg. And so this will start to condition the fast twitch muscle fibers in your lower body more aerobically. You can also do it with sled drags. We'd do it with like sled drag lunges and things like that. And it's really nice to do it with a sled because there's no eccentric loading. And why is that important? Because eccentric loading causes more muscle damage. So eccentric is like the lowering portion of the lift. So think if you're doing a front squat, going down is the eccentric portion of the lift. You need some of that. You have to do it to be ready to handle the stress of going downhill. But when it comes to high intensity continuous training, you do it for relatively high volumes in one session. And so a ton of eccentric loading is oftentimes going to cause too much muscle damage, so you can't recover. So we use it with specific exercises a lot. So for example, right now we're in phase 3 of our early off-season program, and we're doing it with step-ups and things like that. So the sleds are great because they limit eccentric loading. You can load them up pretty heavy and you can drive. So you can just do regular old sled push drives for it, or you could do sled drag lunges for it. Both of those work really well. You could also not probably because I've done it, you could just do sled drags with it. So 2 heavy steps and take your break. So you could do, there's a handful of different ways you can set up HICT. In the earlier season, we'll spread out the reps. So right now we're doing 2 reps, 1 rep each leg every 15 seconds. So as we get into the preseason, we'll do it 1 step every alternating legs every 4 to 5 seconds. So just to increase the work rate. So you could do it both ways when you use the sled as well. It's like, think of it as a partial range of motion lunge, or if you're doing sled drags, like starting with your knee on the ground and actually driving up, you're doing a full range of motion lunge. But if you're in other circumstances, like if you're pushing the sled, if you're just doing regular sled drags, just think of it as a partial range of motion lunge. And you're doing that without a bunch of eccentric loading, which is a really, really good thing. Now, I also really like continuous sled dragging to develop your muscular endurance. And so, you can do this in staying in zone 1. You can do it getting up slightly into zone 3. Both of those things are going to work, but continuous sled dragging to just condition those hamstrings, and glutes and calves to just keep working. And so you can break it up however you want, but just continuous drags are great for that, especially for conditioning your muscles to do that continuous pull uphill, because you'll end up in similar joint angles as you would be if you were marching up a grade. Because you have your pack on. If you're marching up a grade, you're gonna be slightly bent over, and then you're pulling yourself up your hill, while you also drive yourself up the hill. So you end up in similar joint angles. So continuous sled dragging, you could do it for, a total amount of time and rest as you need it. You could do it for a total amount of distance and rest as you need it. Either of those things could work, but they're both really good ways to build muscular endurance and even get in more aerobic training with the sled. And then you think about sleds from a specific standpoint. So if you're like an eastern whitetail hunter, you might be dragging a deer out of the woods. So it's actually specific training for what you do. And so at that point, maybe if you're in the preseason, you could just do continuous sled drags with, I don't know, let's say you kill a real nice buck, that sucker's 200 pounds. You could do continuous sled drags at 200 pounds, resting as you need, to simulate dragging a deer out of the woods. So you're prepared for that. And then just doing it at different angles to develop your legs and your hips and your feet and your ankles. It's also like an extra mobility stimulus, but also kind of like putting you in positions that are awkward because there aren't any straight lines in the woods, right? So we do have to do some things at odd angles to condition ourselves to be able to do that. And sled drags make it really easy to do that because, you know, if you're dragging one sideways, you know, your ankles and your feet are going to be in positions that they normally wouldn't. If you're doing step overs or things like that, it can condition you to, you know, step over and drive, which you might have to step over a log and drive and all those kind of things. So using a sled for specific conditioning to get ready to go into the woods or to go up a mountain is also a really, really good idea. So you can use long story short, you can use the sled in a lot of different ways to program it for hunting. The question is that you always have to answer with whatever you're doing is, what outcome do I want? Because it's just a tool. You're not training the tool, you're using the tool to create an outcome. And that's a really important thing to know, because, you know, people get caught up on tools all the time. They're like, well, I just train with kettlebells, or I just do this, or I just, you know, barbell lifting's where it's at, or blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, what outcome are you trying to produce? Because you have to use the right tool to create the outcome that you want. And that's what we're looking at in this circumstance. Okay. The second question, this actually came from one of our Pathfinder members. And he asked, what mobility training would I recommend for people outside of the gym, outside of what we're doing in our programming? And it's a good question. So I need to explain the difference between Pathfinder and Backcountry Ready to provide context to this. So in Backcountry Ready, you go through different phases of our Backcountry Readiness Assessment. But at each one of those phases of the Backcountry Readiness Assessment, we assess your mobility. We assess your ankle mobility, we assess your hip mobility, and we assess your shoulder mobility. That gives me the ability to direct people on which lifts they should and shouldn't do. So for example, if you have shoulder restrictions, pressing overhead usually is a bad idea because that stress gets disproportionately distributed throughout your body. You end up with neck problems, you end up with worse shoulder problems, you end up with low back pain, upper back pain, those kind of things. So it helps us choose the right lifts for people. But also it tells me which mobility exercises built into our program are going to be most impactful for the person at the time. And so if you have shoulder restrictions, we'll work more on your shoulder mobility throughout the strength training portion. So in most of our strength training workouts, mobility exercises are built in between sets of the strength exercises. So if you have hip mobility issues, you'll do more of that. Hip mobility issues, you'll do more of that. And then, you know, ankle mobility, we tend to build in a lot of ankle mobility into our programs anyway, because we all just need a ton of it for walking uphill and walking downhill. But we'll also make extra ankle mobility built into the program at times as well. Now, on top of that, I will make recommendations for what people should do outside of training. And oftentimes it's just more of the mobility exercises that we are doing in the program, just do more of them away from training. And then I'll also, like, if somebody has an ankle mobility restriction, I'll specifically say, hey, here, do this foot and ankle protocol when you're not at the gym, you know, because it'll help bring things up for you, right? And so that's how we would handle that in Backcountry Ready. Now in Pathfinder, they get a great training program. They follow, honestly, the same training program as the Backcountry Ready folks, but they don't get testing. They don't get the same direction, all that kind of stuff. They get a questionnaire. Based on the questionnaire, I set them up on the right path for them, and then they follow it. And if things come up, I'll help adjust programming and things like that for them to make sure that they're still on the right track. But they don't get the specific testing that allows me to say, this is the best thing for you to do right now. So he's in Pathfinder. He doesn't go through the assessments, so he doesn't have those same recommendations coming from me. So I'm going to give broad recommendations based on that. So first of all, everyone should be doing some kind of general routine every day to move all of their joints to the biggest range of motion as possible, because your brain is really cheap. So if its main focus is keeping you alive and saving calories and keeping your eyes on the horizon so you can find threats and resources. If you don't move your joints, your brain will think it's not important. I'm not going to spend the calories on creating the pathways or maintaining the pathways that allow you to maintain the mobility at that joint. And so it's really important that from a nervous system standpoint, that we continue to do that. Also, just proprioceptively, which is like understanding where you are in relation to space and where different parts of your body are in relation to others. It keeps the finer aspects of your nervous system tuned up so you have better control, right? And so we want both of those things. Then also from a tissue standpoint, it conditions your tissues to go into those positions and maintain them and be strong there. This is important because, you actually influence how those tissues develop. So they continue to lay down their fibers in a way that allows you to achieve these ranges of motion. But also, let's say that you fall and you land like this, okay, on your side. If your shoulder isn't used to going to that position, it has no inputs for going to that position, the chances that you get injured are higher, right? Because your brain doesn't have a strategy and your tissues haven't built up the resilience to be able to handle it. And so that's why it's important to continue to do this every day. I'm going to link a video to my morning mobility routine doing CARS. CARS stands for controlled articular rotation. So essentially they're controlled joint circles. This allows you to move joints through a full range of motion with control, so you gain mobility. So mobility isn't just, the ability to like, if someone grabs your leg, right? You're laying on your back, someone grabs your leg, and then both legs are straight, and they take one leg and they lift it and take it the whole way up to your chest. You have great extensibility, and you could even call that flexibility, but it's not necessarily mobility. Mobility implies control. And so we want to have control at the same time as we have flexibility and tissue extensibility. That's the ability of your tissues to lengthen. So mobility implies control. So CARS, doing them with control, creates the connection between your brain, the finer aspects of your nervous system, and then everything in between, so that you can control your motions as you go through them. I do CARS for those reasons, right? All the tissue things that we talked about, all the brain stuff that we talked about. I've done literally, I'm not kidding you, I've done the same fucking thing since 2013. And it's been wonderful for maintaining my body. And even better than that, it literally, if you look at the video that I put in the show notes, it takes like 1:23 or 1:24 seconds. So there's like literally no excuse not to do it. So typically my routine is, once I start coffee, I just do that because it gives me a nice little trigger that when I start my coffee, I do my mobility routine. It takes less than 90 seconds, and I do it first thing in the morning when you're really good at influencing your tissues and everything. So a general approach to doing something every day is a really big thing. And then from there, outside of the gym, you want to continue to hammer your deficits, because it can often take a lot of inputs to be able to improve mobility. So it's a continual process, and I'll use the ankles as the example. The ankles are the toughest to improve, and it makes sense, right? Because you're standing on your feet so much, and then on top of that, when we sit, I'm sitting in a chair right now, everything's pretty much at a 90-degree angle, and we sit with our ankles at 90-degree angles all the time. So we have to teach them that they can go beyond that in both directions, and it takes a lot of work to do that. On top of that, there's also like pelvic concerns, like is your pelvis sitting in the right position? And if not, and you're like tilted forward, you're putting a bunch of tension on your calves. And your calves and your hamstrings are the only thing that are keeping you from falling on your face. That's honestly why a lot of people can't touch their toes, because they don't know how to push their hips backwards, but also because their hamstrings and calves are getting so much signaling from their brain that they feel tight. They're not necessarily tight. They have extensibility, but they feel tight because they're the only key thing keeping you from falling on your face. So sometimes with ankle mobility, we have to work on getting people back in better pelvic alignment before we even worry about the ankles. But in general, let's just say that the pelvic thing isn't an issue, then it still takes a ton of input to improve ankle mobility. So you have to do it while you train. You need to do it other times, and sometimes actual just static stretching to improve the extensibility of those tissues is really important. And so, for example, throughout the year, we'll do really long calf stretches, like 2 minutes, because to affect actual tissues, you have to hold a stretch for a long time. the 30-second stretches, things like that, you're affecting your nervous system. You're telling your brain, like, it's okay for us to go to this position. But if you want to change tissues, you have to hold it for longer. And so long duration calf stretching is important if you really want to improve your ankle mobility. Now, here's the thing. It's just, you have to do a lot of it. Okay. You have to continually put input. And it's like, mobility is something that you can work on all day long and should work on all day long. Like, you can be anywhere and do a few neck circles. You can be in most places and do a few shoulder circles. You can be in a lot of places and do a few hip circles or something. So it's something that you can work on all day long. Hell, you can, like, if you're, watching TV or in between a project or doing something with your kids, like, you can drop down into a squat and hold a deep squat for 30 seconds. So this is something that you can just build into your life and do all the time. But the biggest things are, have a general routine that you do every day. And then also, if you haven't gotten assessed, figure out how to put yourself through an assessment and figure out what your weak points are and just hammer them all the time until they are no longer a weak point and they're brought up to a good baseline. Okay. So that's how to approach mobility outside of the gym. Okay. So the next question, and I'm paraphrasing this because I forgot to they came in on Instagram and I forgot to screenshot it, was essentially, is the hex bar or the straight bar a better functional deadlift? And we got to start by clearing up what the word functional means when it comes to training, because I think a lot of times the misconception is that functional is based on how something looks. Functional is based on what it produces, right? Does it improve the function of what you're trying to do, right? So you could say, for example, that, like, there's no point in hunters deadlifting. You could make that argument. The issue is, we know that deadlifting pushes your overall strength ceiling better than any other lift because it recruits so much muscle. It's like it recruit like 67% of your muscle mass. So that's a lot of neurological input. So it's easier to use that to raise your strength ceiling. So if someone's not as strong as they need to be based on our standards, I'll have them deadlift more than squat for a while to bring their strength up, and then we'll transition to more squatting. But so if you look at it from that standpoint, it's incredibly functional because it raises relative strength, which allows us to save energy, be more resilient, and then we can apply that strength in different means. So another example, this comes from basketball. If, when players have an injury, right? A lot of good strength conditioning coaches and physical therapists will have basketball players do leg extensions, like seated leg extensions on the leg extension machine. And you would say, well, how the hell does that translate to basketball? It doesn't even seem like it would make sense. But if you know that doing leg extensions recruits some of the main muscles you use for landing when you rebound while playing basketball, recruits them in the same way, then you realize that you're training them to continue their ability to land well when they rebound, even if they can't jump right now. And so leg extensions to meet that function are very important and very useful. So we have to take a step back and realize that functional means outcome. It does not mean what something looks like. Now, as far as the hex bar versus the straight bar, which one? It depends. You'll hear some people say that, the barbell puts too much shear force and stuff on the spine. It's not good for you. So you should only hex bar and all of that kind of stuff. And that's because we're getting caught on tools again rather than outcomes. You use a tool to produce an outcome. So for example, when I figured this out in 2013. I guess a lot of stuff happened that year. 2012, 2013, somewhere in there, I was training a lot of athletes at that point, younger athletes. So middle school, high school, and college kids. I also had some pro athletes at that time too. But I had to teach a lot of people how to deadlift, okay, and take them from the ground up and get them where they need to be. One of the biggest problems when it comes to deadlifting or any exercise for that standpoint is people jump in too far into the deep end when they don't have the requisite movement skills to be able to do what they're asking their body to do. And so I watched this, I broke it down, and figured out a really solid progression that we still use at my gym today, and I still use partially with Pack Mule. And it's based on something called the 4x4 matrix. So the 4x4 matrix, there's this guy named Gray Cook. Gray Cook is one of the best physical therapists in the world and one of the best people at helping people learn to move better. And so this other guy, his name's escaping me right now, but he's also a really good physical therapist and performance coach, was watching Gray Cook work. And essentially he systematized Gray Cook's process for figuring out if an exercise was going to work for somebody. And that's the 4x4 matrix. And so the left side of the matrix is position. So the 1 position is lying on the ground. 2 position is in the quadruped position or the push-up position. The 3 position is either half kneeling, kneeling, or seated. So half kneeling is 1 knee up, 1 knee down. Kneeling is both knees down or seated. And then the 4th position is standing. And then the right side of the matrix is the amount of load, right? So you have unloaded with pattern assistance. So pattern assistance means you're using something to help somebody understand what position they're in. So for example, if you're teaching someone to hip hinge and they're having a really hard time separating spinal movement from hip movement, you can put a pole on their back so their spine stays still, so they understand to just bend at the hips. So that would be unloaded with pattern assistance. Then there would be just unloaded. That means just unloaded. You're just not giving them any weight. The 3rd position would be load with pattern assistance. So this could be, using something like a band to hold a pole on someone's back while they deadlift. Honestly, using a weight belt would be considered pattern assistance, because if you're using a weight belt properly, you're using it to teach your core how to function. You're not just replacing your core with a belt, you're teaching it how to function. So it's pattern assistance. And then the 4th position is just loaded. Okay. And so I broke this down starting with a kneeling deadlift, working up to handcuffed hip hinge, which would be holding a weight behind your back and hinging. And then we go over to what's called a belly swing, where you would hold a kettlebell right in front of your belly and then hinge there. Then down to a kettlebell RDL, because we're moving the load into a more challenging position, a more stressful position. So all we're doing is figuring out which level of threat a person can tolerate at a specific time to be able to learn a movement. And then from the kettlebell deadlift, RDL, we will go to a kettlebell deadlift. And once someone can manage that, we would start to go to barbell RDLs. And once you can manage barbell RDLs, we look at things like rack pulls and hex bar deadlifts. And so with that context, think about tools and outcomes. So a barbell RDL prepares you to hex bar deadlift because you have the immediate input of the bar on your legs. So it tells you whether or not you're hinging well. So if you go straight down, just smack that thing into your knees, into your quads, you know that you're squatting more than you're hinging. So it helps you understand where you are in space better. You have to have that understanding of where you are in space and how you're hinging before you go to a hex bar, because you're standing in the middle of it. You don't have any of those inputs. So you need to have a solid hinge pattern before you get into a hex bar. It accelerates that process. You need to learn. And so when you look at it, it's like, which is more functional? You would say both, because they're achieving different ends. Now, when it comes to the actual strength development from each, you can use more weight with a hex bar typically, but they both work well. Now, one thing I will say is, both in Pack Mule and at my gym, we don't really have people deadlift from the floor anymore. The risk just isn't worth the reward. People have a harder time getting into a good position to deadlift from the floor. And so you increase the risk of something going wrong if you increase that range of motion. So a hex bar deadlift, the way that they're typically set up, is about the same level as a rack pull. We typically teach people to start rack pulling right at the knee. So I guess hex bar deadlift would just be a little bit lower. So in that case, you would argue, well, you would progress from being able to do rack pulls well, then down to the hex bar deadlift. But from an outcome standpoint, they're about the same. You could do either. The biggest thing is just making sure that you have the appropriate amount of skill to be able to hex bar deadlift well. Okay? Let me check my notes real quick, see if I'm not missing anything. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, and thematically through, I guess, with all of these questions, is we have to think in terms of outcomes and how we apply to a tool to achieve an outcome, not necessarily just getting so hyper focused on what's the better tool in general, because there's going to be a better tool for this outcome and another better tool for this outcome. You know, for example, if you wanted to raise your overall strength ceiling better, you would be better served to do a back squat than you would a front squat. You can use more weight. You can put more load on your body. However, the risk isn't worth the reward because most people don't have the mobility requirements throughout their body to back squat well, and they also just don't have the proportions. So it ends up putting too much stress on their low back and their hips, and then they end up with pain. But if you really needed to push it, like if you were an offensive lineman or something like that, a back squat might be appropriate. For most people, it's not. And then you also look at the outcome of what you get from a front squat. You get more quad development. You also get a stronger anterior core because the weight's on the front of your body. Both of those things are hugely important for hunters, right? Because we talked about why we need the quads, but then also if you make your anterior core stronger, it helps resist the forces of having the pack on your back, right? So I don't really program back squats anymore. If someone has a safety bar with the yokes that come over their shoulders, I'll use that because it's kind of halfway in between. And it's also a really great tool for doing heavy split squats. I really like doing them with that. But for the most part, we're going to front squat. We're going to Zercher squat, which is holding the bar in your arms. We're going to goblet squat because we want that anterior load. We want to keep this spinal loading, we decrease it to the point that we can. And we also want the quad development. So we develop everything on the front of our body. Okay, so the biggest thing when it comes to all of this is thinking about the outcome and then applying the tool in the right way. Now, I know that's easy for me to say because I've been doing this for 20 years. And so this kind of stuff, it just, my thought process is really fast and it comes naturally to me at this point. But for you, if you're not training with us and you have to figure these things out for yourself, that's the process that you have to walk yourself through. It's like, what do I want to achieve and what tool is going to help me achieve that? And then you're going to have to go do some learning, right? Like you're going to have to read some articles. You're going to have to watch some videos and start to figure the process out. But that is the fundamental question that you have to ask yourself when it comes to this stuff. Function is about outcome. It's not about how something looks. Keep that in mind. So that's all I have for this episode. As always, I appreciate you listening and watching. In the show notes, there's a link to that mobility video. There's also a link to our pack capacity calculator. You do our 10-minute step-up test, which will show you where you're at with your uphill muscular endurance. But when you plug your numbers into the pack capacity calculator, it gives you an estimate of your safe pack carriage right now. So if you know you're going on an elk hunt or whatever in the fall, and you know about what your pack weight needs to be going in and what you might have to carry packing out, it tells you where you're at safely with that. And you just use 20% of your body weight to do the test, but it tells you where your ceiling is right now. So if you can do a lot of step ups with 20% of your body weight, your ceiling's higher. But if you're at a lower number, your ceiling's much lower. So you know where you are right now and you understand where you need to move yourself towards to be able to handle the hunt that you're going on. 100% free. Go ahead and click that, download it. Why wouldn't you? Yeah, and then you can rerun it. The pack capacity calculator is yours for the rest of your life. I have it set up in a Google Sheet. You can download it and just continue to retest yourself to see where you're at, both on a muscular endurance standpoint and how much pack weight you can handle. All right. As always, again, thanks for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time.